What's going on, everybody? I'm Anthony DeCicci with On the Water. So just recently, I had the opportunity to fish with a big stick on the local bass tourney circuit, Kyle Geggatt. He invited me to go smallie fishing on a local pond in Plymouth, and we had an absolute blast. The bite is very subtle in the winter. He calls it the wet sock bite, where you want to fish small baits, dragged on the bottom really slow. As you're bouncing your bait along the bottom, fishing real slow, any subtle tip that there might be a bite there, hook sets are free. So you'd set that hook and it would feel like you'd hook a dead sock, but halfway up in 20 to 30 feet of water, that smallie would come alive. We got some tail walks, we had an absolute blast. And the key to getting bites on that day was really scaling down to a bite-sized bait. Some of the smallest baits I've personally ever fished. Now, my setup for this trip was an ultralight G. Loomis trout rod paired with a 1000 sized reel, 10-pound Power Pearl braid to 6-pound fluorocarbon. And the baits we were fishing were these Micro Finesse Baits from Z-Man. Now, what I liked about these that were different was the profile is super small. Again, it's the smallest bait I've ever really tried to fish with, and we found immediate success getting these down along the bottom and fishing them real slow. And the smallies responded in a great way. We caught fish at 3 different spots and the action was constant. And it's no surprise that when you fish a bait this small, it's kind of a catch-all bait, all right? So it really lends itself to the keys of being successful in the winter, fishing a small profile and fishing it slow. We were going through the planning stages of getting out to fish on this smallmouth bite. I showed Kyle these baits as we were starting to gear up the boat to get after it. And he started talking about some of the key factors to finding smallies in the winter. You want to target structure. He was keyed in on that 20 to 30 foot depth range, and we ultimately hit 3 different spots. And one thing I learned about smallmouth fishing is the fish really congregate around those types of areas. So what that does is it brings the biomass of smallies in a concentrated area. And when that happens, Sharpies like Kyle flock to those areas on all these ponds, and it results in a lot of pressure on these schooled up smallies. So the first thing he took note of is how small these baits actually are. And his concern was whether or not we could hold bottom with these micro jig heads, which come in 1/10 of an ounce to 1/30th of an ounce. So as we put this plan in action, the light bulbs went off for Kyle, and he's a lot more dialed in than I'll ever be because he fishes the local bass circuit. And one thing that he really pointed out is how this could really be a difference maker on pressured fish. These fish, they see every full-size Ned rig, blade bait, jerk bait, drop shot rig, you name it, just going by their nose one after another. And that makes them super wary. So he was very excited to show them a bait in 5 different options in a much smaller profile. And it really made a difference on this day. And we had a blast catching fish one after another. So what is a micro finesse jig? Basically, it's a Ned style or shroom style jig head. They come in 4 different sizes between 1/10 of an ounce to 1/30th of an ounce. Now these micro finesse baits are made to pair perfectly with these jig heads in each of the sizes. The baits themselves are all 1 3/4 inches long, so it's a very small profile. And they come in 5 different options. You got the Micro TRD, which is that Ned rig style stick bait. You also have the tiny TicklerZ. This is kind of like a hybrid between a stick bait and that tube style bait, and you got these 4 splayed tails here that when the bait is going along the bottom, those tails quiver and undulate even at a pause to elicit more strikes from wary game fish. Moving through the lineup, you got the StingerZ. Now this is kind of a pintail bait, and as soon as Kyle saw this profile, he pointed out how much of a perfect match it has to fry in the ponds that we fish in. A lot of these ponds that grow big bass and have healthy populations throughout of panfish and perch. They have herring that come into the ponds, your bluegills and your panfish, they spawn in the ponds. Even the largemouth bass and smallmouth bass spawn in these ponds. So it's very hard to imitate that fry profile of a really micro-sized bait fish, which these game fish are constantly feeding on. This is a straight tail bait. It's made to fish kind of horizontally along the bottom. And I could see this bait working under a float and fly operation where you got it suspended to be able to control different depths that you're targeting, and it would fish really naturally and really well. And you got that little wiggle going to get bites from game fish with very little action imparted by the angler. Being a swim bait guy myself, moving on, this is the Shad FryZ. It's a mini bite-sized swim bait. This tail gives a nice kicking action even at the fall down to the strike zone. Very little action is required to get this segmented tail to kick, which is going to look natural in the water. It's going to fall slower and get those bites. Now, one of the newest profiles that I saw out of this lineup is this LarvaZ pattern. Now, this is also another bait that I could see fishing really well under a float and fly situation or dragged along the bottom like we were doing on our trip. It reminds me of a creepy crawler from when I was a kid. But it's really designed to be an aquatic invertebrate. And if you think about a pond ecosystem, all kinds of insects are spawning in that pond and creating these oddities that look a lot like this, which is just a different look to be able to offer pressured fish. Now, across all 5 baits here, you have 5 totally different profiles. They all pair perfectly with the jig heads that come in 4 different colors between red, black, chartreuse, and a glow colored jig head. Amongst that, each of these 5 baits here come in 10 different color options. This is the newest lineup from Z-Man, and some of the characteristics that make these look supernatural under the water are the buoyancy of a Z-Man bait. Now, their Elaztech material naturally floats, and that gives you a lot of competitive advantages that separate the Z-Man soft plastics from others in the market. They fall a little slower because of that buoyancy. If you were to fish one of these ones that fish on a horizontal presentation, like the StingerZ with the straight pintail, or the LarvaZ under a float and fly or on a drop shot, you're going to get that presentation that is a little bit more buoyant than some of the other materials that soft plastics are made of. It gives it a much more natural look. So the durability factor with the Elaztech material is another huge benefit to the angler. It simply means more time fishing. You know, these aren't going to get chewed up, the tails aren't going to get bit off as much, and they're going to be super durable. So with just a drop of super glue right at the base of the soft plastic as you push it up on the jig head, so think about how much more time fishing that offers the angler than messing with readjusting their bait or having to change out the soft plastic on the fly as it gets annihilated by game fish. With a bait this small that you can present in a plethora of different ways, it's really a catch-all bait. It's going to work in your trout ponds, it's going to work for your panfish, your perch, and your bass. And you'll get big bites on these small baits too, because that's what the fish are looking for. Can't wait to experiment with these micro finesse baits from Z-Man further.